So that's really the biggest fear is the spillover could be actually pushing these conflicts that we might think is isolated into becoming part of a much larger issue and that actually complicate things.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. For the past year and a half, South Sudan has been on the brink of a new civil war. A 2018 peace deal that ended the last civil war had been faltering, while war across the border in Sudan has threatened to spill south. But according to my interview guest today, Daniel Akech of the International Crisis Group, the tipping point has been breached. We are now in the early stages of a new, full-blown civil war in South Sudan. One that may prove even more destructive than the previous 2013-2018 conflict, which left an estimated 400,000 people dead. There are a number of reasons for this, not least is the civil war in Sudan, which has decimated oil revenues that long underpinned South Sudan's political economy. And as in the first civil war, ethnic tensions are being deliberately stoked, raising the prospect of mass atrocities. We kick off by discussing recent events on the ground in South Sudan, including an offensive by opposition forces sparked by the arrest and prosecution of Riek Machar, a former vice president who once led one side of the previous civil war. We then explore the potential trajectory of this conflict, how it is intimately tied to the war in Sudan, and the role of key regional actors. South Sudan is a new country, having gained independence from Sudan in 2011, but just 2 years later, civil war erupted, killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, and destroying infrastructure across the country. This new outbreak of violence may lead to something just as bad or worse, but it's received little attention in the Western press. I view it as my key role and the role of this show to bring attention to these conflicts that don't receive the kind of coverage they deserve and do so in a way that gives listeners nuance and understanding of what's happening, why, and what may prevent the situation from getting even worse. And so a very big thank you to Daniel Akech for bringing that kind of depth and nuance to this conversation. We recorded our conversation live via Substack, and as always, you can go to globaldispatches.org to get a subscription and support my work. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Daniel Akech of the International Crisis Group. So, Daniel, first of all, thank you for taking time to speak with me later in the evening in Nairobi. I do appreciate your time, but I wanted to reach out to you specifically because I did read your dispatch from last week, essentially declaring that war has returned to South Sudan. You know, for a long time, I've been describing South Sudan, as I'm sure you have, as on the precipice of a return to civil war. But there's been that tipping point over the last couple of weeks, and I'm curious to learn from you what has happened in South Sudan to create that kind of rhetorical shift from a precipice to the civil war to an onset of a civil war.
The first thing is that the developments now on the ground, it started in late December, around Christmas time, when the opposition forces made up of armed youth as well as forces that are loyal to the former vice president, who is undergoing some prison trial now in Juba, and also other oppositions that are not affiliated with that main opposition. It started to take towns in eastern and northern Jonglei. Jonglei is one of the 10 states making up South Sudan. They started attacking the government barracks, and they were successful in taking those. In at least 3 counties, they managed to actually delete government presence in those counties within a matter of few weeks. And then they actually made moves to 2 other counties. Jonglei is made up of 9 counties. So already 5 counties had seen these opposition attacks where they have succeeded in taking territories. But then while this was happening, this war of taking new territories by the oppositions was happening in Jonglei, there was also another conflict happening in Equatoria, which has 3 states. And this was on a much lower scale, but was very strategic, was aimed at cutting off the trade routes to Juba, especially the ones connecting Juba to Kenya and Uganda. And Juba actually depends on imports from these neighboring countries. So this was something big that the opposition started attacking small border posts on the Kenyan South Sudan border, and then also in Unity States, which is another state where the oppositions try to actually move closer to the oil facilities. So that also looks like what is happening is a strategic calculation, is taking new territories as well as cutting off the supply lines for the trade routes into Juba from neighboring countries, as well as trying to maybe shut down the oil that has remained operational in Unity States. So that's really what is happening. Why is this happening now? One major reason for this is that the leader of oppositions, who was a former vice president, Riek Machar, had last year in March, he was placed under house arrest. And then in September, the government put him through a trial. He's being charged with treasons, crimes against humanity. The oppositions are not taking this well because this is their leader. And although the people actually fighting now are not all loyal to him, is being used as a symbol for rallying to fight against a common enemy. And that's really the main trigger. But there are other lesser issues that are also playing out in addition to this political tensions in Juba, which has been brewing since last year.
So essentially, you had Riek Machar, the former vice president, who was installed as vice president as part of a 2018 peace deal that ended the previous South Sudan civil war, has been in prison and tried in the capital Juba on a variety of charges, and sort of a coalition of opposition forces have now taken certain strategic outposts in parts of South Sudan, potentially even threatening Juba itself. How has the government responded thus far?
The regional instability, the role of the external backers of the government, one of which is Uganda. The president of Uganda had, since 2013, when the conflicts broke out for the first time in South Sudan, he has been actually backing the government. And in March, when this flare-up started last year, Ugandan forces also deployed to South Sudan. So it was expected that they would actually deploy once more. It did not seem to have happened. Government in the states resorted to mobilizing maybe the army on basically ethnic lines. So the opposition is overwhelmingly one ethnic group, and then the government is overwhelmingly another ethnic groups. The opposition is led by many fighters from the opposition come from the newer ethnic group who are predominantly in Upper Nile regions. And then the presidents come from the Dinka ethnic groups who predominantly are the majority in Barghazal regions. So that seems to be the directions the government is pushing the war into. In Upper Nile, the compositions of the ethnic groups is mainly the largest groups that actually interact mostly are the Nuer and Dinka, and then the Shilluk also in the mix. And there is also Murle in that setting. Currently, the forces fighting in Jonglei against the oppositions comprise of the government and then armed militia groups that are aligned with the government. This includes the Chuluk militia groups and the Dinka militia groups. So that has been the trends we are seeing, and it's actually really worrying to see leaders mobilizing forces along ethnic lines, and things could actually get out of hand. Some of the commanders have been actually engaging in issuing out bad rhetoric, basically encouraging forces to engage in targeting civilians. And that is really worrying. So the government is trying now to retake those areas, those barracks that were taken by the opposition. So the war is currently happening in northern Jonglei.
So you have these really disturbing ethnic divisions that are being stoked by the government, you say, in order to increase ethnic Dinka support to fight ethnic Nuer militias for battle over control of the country, potentially, which is, of course, what we saw in South Sudan's first civil war. And a lot of the key players right now are the very same key players that fought in this first civil war shortly after the birth of South Sudan as an independent country in 2011. So I think it's probably worthwhile for listeners and frankly for me to understand your perspective on how that first civil war led potentially to the war we're seeing today. So can you take us back a little bit and help us understand the broader context in which that first civil war played out, in which something like 400,000 people lost their lives?
So South Sudan became independent in 2011 from Sudan. And that independence was basically a political achievement. The country remained dependent on oil, which has to go to the market through the Sudanese land. So the divorce was not very clean.
That's just like kind of one important point to emphasize, that South Sudan has the oil, but not the export capacity. There's no ports. The South Sudanese oil typically flows through Sudan to the port of Sudan.
And while that oil could have been seen as a blessing, one of the biggest problems it has done is that the kind of stability in South Sudan that we have been seeing is basically to bring elites together and hold them together to share the oil revenue. In 2012, South Sudan went into war with Sudan over border issues. And then a year later, the political leaders in South Sudan created their own civil war among themselves. It was basically contesting for power. It was power struggles among themselves. And that war went on until in 2018, when it was actually resolved through these peace agreements. And that peace agreements, it brought back all these factions that splintered in 2013. And then they were brought back into a bloated coalition government that brought the president and the vice president, Riek Machar, together into the same government, plus other vice presidents that were created to accommodate all these groups that were fighting one another. In 6 years of that agreement, they did not manage to actually implement the provisions of the agreements. It was basically lots of brinkmanship. They were fighting each other, trying to undo each other while they are sitting in the same government. And then a war broke out in Sudan in April 2023. That war actually slashed off 75% of the revenues that were actually the glue holding this large government together. And that is when the president decided that he had to cut off some of the people who were taking from a port that was actually drying up. And this is really what happened when the president started engaging in these purges. He was firing people and zeroing in on smaller and smaller groups. By doing this, he basically dismantled the key provisions of the agreements, which was the security arrangements. So this was violated, the power sharing among the elites in military terms as well as political terms. These provisions were violated. And that actually set off the kind of problems we are seeing now. It led to, as part of that purges that the president was doing, we ended up seeing Machar being placed under house arrest, conflicts breaking out in Nasir, in eastern Upper Nile, which is part of northern Jonglei. And then now we ended up with the main opposition leader who was supposed to implement the agreement with the president being placed under trial, which the oppositions, in their perspectives, they are seeing this as a legal assault on their leader, and they are coming out to react to that. As we speak now, having seen the war happening now, being connected to the previous civil war, as well as the peace agreements that was meant to actually end the conflicts and then to transition the country into democracy, none of which had been seen progressing well. The president himself, by reshuffling the government, firing some of his closest allies in the security sector and financial sector. He basically made his own camp weak. And then at the same time, by arresting Machar, the opposition doesn't have a central command. Although it's very effective in staging the kind of offensives we've been seeing, it's not really well coordinated at the top. So there are higher chances of infighting within the oppositions. And then the government itself is already weakened by the purges that the president had carried out. So what that means is that the warring sides are no longer actually with the same strength that they had in 2013. So this is a big difference in what we are seeing
So
now.
everyone's a bit weaker, it seems, than they were in 2013 when the first civil war broke out. But it's fascinating and disconcerting, but I suppose somewhat predictable that the emergence of civil war in South Sudan is a direct consequence of the war in Sudan itself, for the fact that it resulted in the sharp decrease of oil exports, which was, like, as you said, the glue that held this elite bargain together for so long. But once the exports dried up, you said by a factor of like 75%, then there wasn't enough money to go around to satisfy all of the elites, and these purges started to happen, and resulting ultimately in the arrest and detention and prosecution of Riek Machar. So I suppose that, of course, suggests that there is profound external influence on events in South Sudan. You mentioned earlier Uganda has come in support of the government. What sort of external forces are supporting the opposition in South Sudan right now?
As we speak, South Sudan is facing an arms embargo from the UN. So no regional country would openly come out saying that we are supporting oppositions. But people are seeing a pattern where the opposition leader is not there anymore. So the wave of these offensives, the opposition offensive in all these areas, is suggesting that there has to be something coming in from outside, even if it's not necessarily the weapons. In South Sudan, all you need today is just the cash to be able to actually go buy weapons in the black market. So there seems to be something like that. We don't have hard evidence suggesting that one particular group is doing that. But in recent months, we have seen the Sudanese warring parties trying to win over Juba. The Sudan Armed Forces is linked to Juba through oil because they get some share of that oil. Also, the Rapid Support Forces have been aligned with the new opposition groups in Nuba Mountains inside Sudan, which historically was linked to the government in South Sudan. So this is giving the impression that the Sudan armed forces are seeing Juba as leaning closer to the Rapid Support Forces. And that is actually something many South Sudanese are thinking maybe the Sudan armed forces could be actually helping the oppositions. And are they interested in actually overthrowing the government in Juba? I doubt if that is the case, but they could use these activities as leverage on Juba because there is something that they continue coming back to the table to talk about the oil flow. The smaller portion of the oil is still flowing, and this is actually flowing through a territory controlled by rapid support forces. And then when the oil cargoes are picked up in Port Sudan, the Sudan Armed Forces are the one controlling that area. So Juba has been managing to play both sides. But until now, it's actually maintaining this balance is becoming a bit harder for them.
That's fascinating. So essentially, the rapid support forces, the opposition in Sudan, essentially has more control over the oil fields and oil pipelines, but the Sudanese armed forces, the government, has control over the actual export and sale of that oil. I'm wondering if, to the extent that like the drying up of oil revenue was directly led to the outbreak of civil war in South Sudan, if like a resumption of oil production and a cooperative agreement might be the solution here.
You cannot separate the two conflict systems. And that's the biggest fear we are seeing now, that they could overlap as time progresses. And part of the problem is not just the economic dependency of one country on the other, is the fact that the fighters during the civil wars in Southern Sudan are pretty much linked to that violent systems or security system in Sudan. And so alliances are very easy. You could find today in Jonglei, as the fighting is happening, you have an opposition leader who split off from the main opposition, led by Riek Machar, some time back. And that leader was in Port Sudan with the Sudan Armed Forces for a very long time. Now he's already sent back in northern Jonglei, where he's actually operating there as part of the opposition. So you could see that there is this kind of linkages. And then Southern Sudanese were also fighting as low-grade mercenaries on both sides of the conflict in Sudan. So these are also able to come back with their weapons system into what is happening in South Sudan. So they are linked in terms of security as well as the economic dependency of South Sudan on Sudan. So this is making it very difficult to distinguish. For a long time, you cannot really have a long view of conflict system being completely separate. They overlaps in so many areas. And that's the biggest fear, that we could see this drawing in proxy violence from the regions, because Uganda had some issues historically with the government of Sudan. And so they're already backing one side. If the government of Sudan, if we could say there is such a thing, then they would actually naturally back the oppositions. And this could actually become a regional black hole where conflicts get out of hand.
So, having covered conflicts like this for so long, one kind of recurring dynamic is that the longer these conflicts go on, the harder it is to stop. You said earlier that the opposition potentially might splinter because it doesn't have that single unifying figure, Riek Machar, who's currently languishing in prison in Juba. So there might be a splintering of opposition forces, which again makes resolving or reining in conflict spirals much more difficult. So I'm curious to learn from you, Daniel, in these kind of early days of the onset of a renewed civil war in South Sudan, what can be done? What can the international community at large be doing right now to try to put an end to this before it gets worse, before conflict dynamics catch and spiral?
There is a need to de-escalate, especially in Jonglei, where the government is now trying to push back. Basically, they are trying to reverse the tide against the oppositions in northern and eastern Jonglei. That would need people Salva Kiir, the president, could listen to. And one of these people is President of Uganda. Although he's backing of the government, which is in their thinking, it's sort of like stabilizing and securing Juba, this could be turned into more positive engagements where it could be turned into helping the president to de-escalate from violence. And then also on the opposition side, you were right that what could be done when Machar is actually now incommunicado, he cannot talk with his commanders on the ground. So there has to be a channel where the regional leaders and global leaders as well would actually reach out to some of these new actors, because the war is already generating new actors who were not even part of the previous agreements. So that is something that could go a long way if these leaders are acknowledged and then also approached, so that the first thing should be cessation of hostilities. Without that, you cannot really roll out anything. But then once you achieve that, then there has to be a need for a new forum. There is a need to acknowledge that the existing agreement has already been overtaken by these new events. And so just going back to try to edit that agreement, Riek Machar will be happy with that because the agreement naturally was favorable to him. But there are more people that are involved now at the grassroots. So there is a need to actually roll out something bigger that could maybe help, rather than going back to power sharing among the elites. It should be something that will actually speed up the roadmap to maybe transitions. And that's something regional leaders with influence on Juba, the pressure should be actually on them to help stop the violence from escalating further.
So, I mean, if that doesn't happen, what kind of events are you looking towards that will suggest to you in the coming days and weeks about how this conflict might unfold? Like, might we see, for example, a direct attack on Juba itself by opposition forces?
Well, we have to do a bit of mathematics. We have to continue renewing our beliefs on whether these attacks will escalate to Juba. The first place where we need to look at is the capital of Jonglei. It's called Bor. So if the conflicts actually get to Bor, it will be so easy to get to Juba. Why? Because the road is actually it's a nice road. It takes only 2 hours driving from Bor to Juba. So the government seems to be making sure that the conflict doesn't get there. And maybe the opposition would want to make sure that they get there. So that's really where they are now. The fighting that is happening now in northern Jonglei, in Ayut County, Uror, and Ural counties is basically meant for that. That if the government, which is offensive now, they are basically trying to take back areas that they lost. If they don't succeed, if the opposition manages to actually reverse that, that will be really bad because it would actually lead to atrocities against civilians. If the government succeeds also in pushing to retake these areas, civilians are also going to be actually harmed because the kind of rhetoric we're hearing from these leaders is not very good. So either way, it doesn't work out very well for the civilians in Jonglei who had been actually facing lots of climate shocks in the last 5 years. This whole area was flooded. So that is really the biggest fear now among civilians is that they were trying to get back home and then they're greeted with this new attacks on them. That's not very good.
So, lastly, this is not an issue that has got much mainstream media attention thus far. You often don't see much global or Western media coverage of conflicts like this unless there are some bigger, broader global implications, international implications. Like, are there broader global geopolitical or international implications should this crisis descend into the kind of major civil war that we saw almost a decade ago?
Yes, there are, one of which is basically the regional dynamics where the Gulf states are now fighting one another in the regions. And people wonder what part of that is actually spilling over into areas like South Sudan. You have the Saudis and United Arab Emirates competing in the regions. And Sudan is already sort of like linked into that. The spillover is very clear from the external backers of both warring sides in Sudan. But then it's very easy to actually look at South Sudan as a subset of what is happening in Sudan. And that's really the biggest problem. It could draw in people. We're talking of if the opposition are not getting weapons directly from one side, could they be getting money from some? And that money would likely come from that kind of dynamics because the Sudan armed forces don't have cash of their own to share with the groups in South Sudan. So if that is the case, then it could escalate because then the competition becomes arming your groups better. And then now we will not see separate conflicts happening in the region, but rather one big conflict because some of the regional countries that are neighboring South Sudan already look into what is happening. And that's kind of the discussions people are having over where does Uganda fit into what is happening in Sudan? Just forget South Sudan for now. Where does this or that other country, where do they actually fit into what is happening in South Sudan? So that's really the biggest fear is the spillover could be actually pushing these conflicts that we might think is isolated into becoming part of a much larger issue and that actually complicate things.
Well, Daniel, this is all very disconcerting, but thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.